Hello, so today we're going to be looking at the early development of Rome, the earliest history, how Rome began. So our major objective for today will be to try to identify and then later explain how earlier cultures influenced or impacted Roman society. So how did the civilizations that existed around the Mediterranean before Rome impact the way the Romans developed their own culture and their own civilization? So first, Rome has two founding myths. So two myths about how Rome began. And as we learn about these two myths, I want you guys to think about, what do myths tell us about a society? So the first myth is related to this character Aeneas. And Aeneas is a character from the ancient Greek poem, the Iliad, which was created, or at least accredited to, the blind poet Homer. And the story of the Iliad is the war or the fight between the Mycenaean Greeks who had attacked the city of Troy, which was on the coast of Anatolia. Now, this story, this epic poem, the Iliad, is not thought to be historically accurate. However, we do know at this time the Greeks were building colonies on the coast of Anatolia. So this story might reflect some of the conflict that happened between the Greeks when they started to build those colonies with the local people who were already living in Anatolia. So at the end of the Iliad, the Greeks win the battle and destroy the city of Troy, which had never been defeated before. Aeneas was a prince from the city of Troy, and as the city is being destroyed, he flees. He runs away, bringing his father and young son, as you can see in the little picture in the background of this slide. He flees and runs away from Troy. And Virgil, a Roman poet, wrote this poem known as the Aeneid, and this is the story of Aeneas's journey from when he flees Troy until he finds his new home. So the Aeneid covers Aeneas's story with his father and son trying to find a new place to live. Their journey is very difficult. There's many problems along the way. Eventually, they land on the coast of Italy in the territory of the Latins. And Aeneas meets King Latinus, the first leader of the Latins, and through his strength and honor, he's able to convince the king to allow him to marry his daughter. So Aeneas eventually becomes king of the Latins, and he helps kind of strengthen the Latins as they compete with the other groups around them on the Italian peninsula. The second myth, founding myth of Rome, is connected to how the city Rome itself was built. While Aeneas was focused on the history of the Latins as a group, Romulus and Remus is focused specifically on the city of Rome. So Romulus and Remus were meant to be descendants of Aeneas, not sons or grandsons, but great-great-grandsons, let's say. And so the story of Romulus and Remus is that they were abandoned as babies and were raised by a wolf. And eventually, as they grow older and grow stronger, they have this plan to build a city. However, the brothers do not agree on where to build the city. Romulus wants to build it on the Palatine Hill next to the Tiber River. Remus wants to build it on another hill. The brothers' argument over where to build the city is so intense that Romulus eventually kills Remus and starts to build his city of Rome. Romulus himself is actually known as the first king of Rome, and we'll look at that a little bit more closely next time when we look at the early kings of Rome. To wrap up our consideration of the founding myths of Rome, I want you guys to think about, what do these myths that we've learned about, the myth of Aeneas and that of Romulus and Remus, what does that tell us about Roman identity? The Roman character. Why would Romans want to be connected to these leaders? What's good or interesting about them? Why would they want to be connected to these stories? As we start our second portion of our lesson today, we're going to be looking at two important cultures or civilizations that influence Romans. And those are specifically the Etruscans and Greeks. So as we go through the rest of the lesson, I want you to think about, in which ways did the Etruscans and Greeks influence Roman society? What do you think the most important influence that they had on early Rome was? So we already learned a little bit about the myths of the founding of Rome. Now we want to look at the actual history that archaeologists have been able to discover so far. So the Latins were a group of people living on the west coast of central Italy. And as you can see here, guys, the Latins were a minor kingdom around the 800s, 700s, 600s BCE. And this is the time in which the city, or really at that time, the village of Rome, was built on the hills above the Tiber River. So at this time, the Latins were a very small kingdom surrounded by a larger kingdom to the north, which was controlled by the Etruscans, and then the various Greek city-states, the Greek colonies that had been built on the coast of southern Italy, as well as on the island of Sicily. So by looking at this map, that can kind of explain to us why the Etruscans and Greeks had such an influence on Rome. So the Etruscans were really kind of the dominant group in Italy in that time period, from the 800 BCEs to around 600 BCE. And they, in fact, even conquered Rome. And Rome was ruled by Etruscan kings for a number of years. So not surprisingly, the ideas and culture of the Etruscans was brought to Rome and influenced the way Romans thought. As for the Greeks, with their different colonies all over southern Italy and Sicily, as well as all over the Mediterranean, they were frequently trading with the Latins, with the different towns all over the Italian peninsula. So as those Italians brought trade to the Latin areas and the Roman areas, they also brought Greek ideas and Greek culture with them. One direct influence that we can see in the physical ruins of Etruscan towns and Roman towns is the impact of Etruscan engineering on early Rome. So a couple of major ideas that the Romans borrowed or used that came from earlier Etruscan towns include the use of the arch in building their buildings, specifically towns and major public buildings, and then also the use of caniculus, what the Romans called caniculus, which are essentially irrigation ditches built and dug into the ground so that water could move from one place to another to improve farming. The other major influence that the Etruscans had on Romans was in terms of entertainment. A couple of different sports were originated, or at least came from the Etruscan culture and then became very common and popular in later Roman culture. And these are slave fighting and chariot racing. Slave fighting often had several different slaves fighting against each other, or different teams or groups of slaves fighting against each other to the death. And the origins of this practice was it was kind of a ritual fighting at important events. So at funerals or other religious holidays or celebrations, slave fights would be held to honor the gods. And the winner, the one that had survived the slave fight, that had proven their strength and their bravery, was then sacrificed, was then executed to pay homage or honor to the gods. Chariot racing, obviously horse racing is a sport we still see today. The chariot racing of Etruscan times and ancient Roman times could be more violent or more intense than the horse racing we see today, primarily because the chariot riders were actually tied into the chariot. So they could not get out of the chariot. They were tied in. So if two chariots collided against each other, or if a chariot flipped over, the man, the charioteer driving the chariot, could get injured or even crushed by the other chariots or the horses running in the race. So these two sports became incredibly popular throughout ancient Rome and were used to entertain the public and keep the public happy. So before we move on to how the ancient Greeks influenced Rome, I want you guys to think about in what ways did the Etruscans influence Roman culture. You see there's some words there to get you guys started. Chat with a partner next to you for a moment, and we will share our responses. Just like the use of arches is a very clear and obvious influence of the Etruscans on Romans that we can see in the buildings built by those two different cultures, we can also see the way in which Greek architecture influenced the Romans. And, most obviously is in terms of temples and public buildings. surrounded by marble columns with carvings of mythological scenes depicted on the sides of these buildings. This is a very obvious influence that the Greeks had on the Romans. Other influences that the Greeks had on the Romans are in connections to their writings, their stories and their poems. So a lot of stories and poems from the Greeks were later recreated, rewritten, retold by the Romans. Also, the Greek tradition that started in Athens of posting their written laws in public places or other government announcements for all the people to see, all the citizens to see, was also continued in Rome. The art of the Romans was, the art of the Greeks, rather, was collected by the Romans. So Romans purchased a lot of Greek art, whether that be pottery or painting or sculpture, and not surprisingly, those different pieces of art influenced Roman artists themselves. One big difference, however, was while Greek art, whether it be painting or sculpture, tended to show the ideal or perfect image of man, so perfect, beautiful muscles, lovely faces, etc., Roman art, Roman paintings and sculptures tended to be more realistic. So everybody was not having rippling six-packs and flawless faces. A final notable influence that the Greeks had on the Romans was the mythology of the Greeks. Now, the Romans had been influenced by Etruscan rituals and holidays, but really Greek mythology became very dominant. And the early Roman gods that existed before the Greeks kind of communicated their myths and their gods were kind of combined with those of the Greeks and then given Roman names. So the Roman pantheon of gods ends up looking very similar to the Greek pantheon of gods, right? You have Ares for the Romans, Ares for the Greeks becomes Mars for the Romans, right? Now, how the Greeks used these myths and these tales of their gods and how the Romans used them is slightly different. The Greeks seemed very focused on creating this very deep set of myths and tales that showed people how to live and also entertained people, whereas the Roman focus in terms of religion was more on doing their rituals, their different religious acts, in the right way and at the right time. They weren't as interested in the stories and creating new stories and myths to go with the gods. Now that we've learned about the Romans and how those early Romans were influenced by these other cultures, I want us to take a few minutes and create a graphic organizer to show in what ways the Etruscans and Greeks influenced Roman culture and society. As you complete that, that's the end of our lesson for today.